tonight I'm just going to take you through a few slides that are, if you like, a summary of a report that they refer to as a COMAR report, and essentially it's the gathering of information on from a cultural perspective, if you like. So in terms of those natural resources that are out there that iwi Māori have historically depended on for either sustenance or for cultural materials for various uses. So without any further ado, we will get underway. Gail Tipper is the person who is the author of the particular report that I've just mentioned, and normally she would be here doing this, so I'm going to cover that off for you tonight, so bear with me please. So we've got our first slide there, restoring the cultural health of streams in the Waimakariri Rakahuri zone. And essentially for mana whenua, that's about, if you like, having abundant taonga species or species that they treasure, especially mahinga kai and those cultural materials. So mahinga kai really just refers to, it's often just talked about in terms of food, but really it's about all of the natural resources that you can get from the water or from land associated and connected to that water, essentially from the mountains to the sea. And of course, some of you all know the history of Ngāi Tahu people. They moved around with the seasons to, depending on what foods were available and where, whether they're up in the Lakes District or whether they were down on the coast or whether they were down south on the Mutton Islands or wherever that happened to be. And they moved from the top of the South Island right to the bottom, and they come back and forwards. And this particular place here is actually pivotal and well, it is that. This was the hub, this particular district, the Waimakariri district. Kaiapoi here is named after essentially the Kaiapoi area and where the pā was. And this was, if you like, the key place where Ngāi Tahu, so that there are 5 primary hapu in the whole South Island, and this one was based here. So pretty much every Ngāi Tahu person that's alive today, and there's some 55,000 plus of those people, can connect back to this place, and have got an interest in the cultural association, if you like. This particular slide here is giving you a bit of an indication, if you like, of where things sit in terms of the water quality and the water quantity and the impacts that has in terms of some of those cultural materials and mahinga kai that I'm talking about. And you'll see there that it names a number of places: Saltwater Creek, the Okuku River, Taranaki Creek, Little Ashley. And part of the reason that those are in there is because these are some of those key places and sites that are still important to mana whenua, and that they want to either have a relationship and a connection to, or be able to re-engage and have a connection to, and actively, if you like, be able to access those natural resources over time as things are restored. As the graph, the chart's actually showing that if you look to the left there where it's got the red and the orange, that's largely, in terms of the numbering there, is giving you an indication that that is the more degraded end, if you like. And as you move towards the green, you're getting more to increased cultural health. So ideally, from a cultural point of view, mana whenua would be wanting things to be more up in the green. And as I go through the next couple of slides, it'll just highlight a little bit more what I'm talking about. So as you go from left to right, you're looking at an increased cultural health and also increased cultural use. The next slide is just continuing on from the one that I've just talked about. And you'll see a number of places there named if you go down the left-hand side: the Rakahuri River, Taranaki Stream, Ashley Zone, and the Waimakariri zone itself. And what it's referring to is that if you look at the Rakahuri River, for example, of 5 sites, only 1 site was considered to be, if you like, culturally safe to be able to access and you know, undertake getting your hands on, if you like, those natural resources. And in terms of that, just so that you know, mahinga kai, mahi means to actually, is exactly that. It means to work. Mahi means to work, so it means putting your hands on things, you know, whether it's food, whether it's plant materials, or whatever. And so, sticking with that one, the Rakahuri River, if you look across, essentially that means that 80% of those particular sites that were monitored over a period of 12-month period were no longer able to sustain cultural values from a mana whenua point of view. So the water quality and the flows there, essentially, it's saying that, you know, it's insufficient to sustain mahinga kai. And there's no point me reading the rest because they're pretty much saying a similar thing. You can see that for yourself. The next slide refers to, it's got their concerns given the current state. So essentially, you'll recall Dave might have made reference to, and some of you may have been here in those, the earlier meetings that were, earlier meeting that was held here, which was largely about the current state. And so that information in terms of the COMAR, the cultural assessment and analysis that's been done in terms of the current state. These are some of the concerns, if you like, that are on here. When it's quite, there's quite a bit there to look at, but you can have a look at it quietly there for yourself. But essentially, it's touching on the ecological degradation side of things, the economic opportunities being limited as a consequence of degradation, and the cultural impacts and loss around that, social impact, and human illness potentially, because if you're talking about, you know, gathering wild foods and that sort of thing, there's a well, depending on the quality of the water and whatnot, there can be contamination and things like that. The next slide down is essentially about the Rakahuri and from the gorge to the sea. And this is about minimum flow and water quality bands. And essentially, mana whenua are saying an increased flow in the gorge needs to be sufficient to enable a visible connected flow of water downstream to the coast, including a visible connected flow in the Rangiora Reach, and provide passage for migratory species. Kiutiki tai, that's what Dave alluded to before, which essentially means from the mountains to the sea. For mana whenua, of course, everything is connected, and they don't even see, if you like, a distinction between even the land and the sea. The land just continues, and it continues under the sea, and so from the mountains to the sea. The next slide is talking about some of the flows and the whānau flow preferences. Whānau meaning the whānau is, these days it's often referred to in a contemporary sense to the family or the nuclear family, but in actual fact whānau is extended family, so it can be lots of people. And so the whānau preferences here, for example, and I won't read them all, but you'll get the gist. If you have a look at the first one, the Ashley River Gorge, the whānau preferences for a visible connected flow. That's pretty self-explanatory. They want to be they want to be able to see the water and have it connected. Where you can do that, there are some places, of course, probably the water might, depending on where you are, might disappear under the gravels and re-emerge somewhere else, and maybe that's just the way that place is. And historically, with Ngāi Tahu, if you look at the old black maps and whatnot back in the 1800s, wherever those, where the river was like that, there were no nohoanga places. It was quite interesting. It lines up with the Western science, and even today, there were no nohoanga as a place to sit. They were traditional campsites. and most of those places were all where tributaries and streams run into the main stem and things like that. They were where water was, and where there wasn't any water, there wasn't any. And there were literally hundreds of sites like that in rivers and streams and that in this district, from the mountains, the foothills, down across the plains and down to the ocean. And of course, it's a highly modified landscape now, and a lot of those places no longer exist, but there are still some key ones that iwi mana whenua still feel are fundamental and are actually, it's possible to be able to restore, do something about them, or even to just maintain some of them in a good condition. So, carrying on from that first one, so a visible connected flow, but in this case, this is a significantly higher minimum flow than the current minimum flow. And you'll see a few more there, even the next one is the same. What they're looking to there, they're seeking there is a significantly higher minimum flow than the current minimum flow. And so it goes on. The next slide. And so these are streams in the Waimakariri zone. The North Brook, for example, the whānau flow preference is for 590 litres a second, and this is higher. This is a higher minimum flow than the current minimum flow in the Waimakariri Regional River Plan. The Middle Brook, 601 litres a second. This is the current minimum flow that's in the plan, so wanting to maintain that, and so on and so forth down the page. In terms of the next slide, what's new? So the first bullet point is step up. If the minimum flow is breached, then the river has to recover before takes can start again. This is something that mana whenua are seeking in this process. So this is one of their preferences. And this is proposed for the Cam, Rakahuri at State Highway number 1. The next slide is referring to water quality bans for streams in the zone. And if you look at number 1, water quality protected where currently high, and where degraded, improved to drinkable quality, especially Taranaki Creek, Cam, Kaiapoi and Rakahuri. So they're aiming for a very high threshold. Of course, it's an aspirational threshold, whether you get there or not. Well, who knows? The next slide, there are half a dozen bullet points there, and this is in relation to other outcomes. So other outcomes sought from a solutions package. So in the process of developing up a solutions package, and so there's a strong desire here, if you like, to obtain some of these things, like number 1, allocations for cultural purposes, put in place starting with allocations in Rakahuri and Cam. Number 2, unless new water and allocations for cultural purposes, it's saying there that mana whenua would not be wanting to support allocation for irrigation. Number 3, Taranaki Creek to be a whole of catchment enhancement program, the Cam to be restored. Levels in the springs and the lower reaches protected so they don't run dry, like for example Little Ashley. Floodgates at Taranaki Creek and Cam retrofitted to restore passage for the indigenous fishery. And the use of reserves and easements enabled. The video we saw there before of Tutaipatu, will just following the coast, you'll come across some certain reserves known as Fenton reserves. They used to have water and whatnot in them at one time, were available to them, and they don't have water there now. Those reserves have individual owners, if you like. So, and they're run by trusts or incorporated societies, and there's opportunities there for people to put some water in there and maybe connect it up with the likes of what we just saw there on that video, for example. So mana whenua would like to be able to do those sorts of developments, but of course you have to have water and whatnot to be able to do that. all spring heads mapped, protected, and a buffer around them. And I think that's all I've got.